Hello students, and welcome to lesson 3 of applications of percents. In this lesson we are going to be talking about simple interest. Again, our essential questions are the same as they have been in the previous 2 lessons. We are looking at how percents can be used when buying a home, what are down payments, taxes, and interest, and in this lesson we are specifically focused on the interest portion and how it is calculated. When buying a home, few people have enough money saved to pay for their house in full. Instead, many people rely on a bank to give them a loan. Banks cannot just give money away and be repaid at no profit. Therefore, they charge interest. What this means is, if they would give you a certain amount and you only give them that same amount back, they're not making any money, and then they can't fund their business. So the way that they fund their business is through interest. Interest is a percentage of, there you hear those same words, percent of. So interest is a percent of a loan that is paid to the bank as payment for borrowing money. We pay interest because we borrowed money. We took out a loan. Interest is how banks afford to give loans and pay their employees. It's a necessary part of their business. We're going to talk about simple interest in this lesson. There are 2 types of interest, simple and compounding, but we are only going to be focused on simple interest. Interest, remember, is a percent of the loan that is paid for each year that money is borrowed. There is a formula for how this is calculated, and it has 4 parts. Most people remember it as I equals PRT. We say PR and T next to each other, which signals multiplication. So simple interest, which is the I, is equal to principal, which is the amount of money you borrow or invest, you've heard that in your dailies, times the rate of interest, which if you see right here, rate of interest is a percent. So we know that we are going to be using a decimal, times the time that we're borrowing the money, and notice that the time must be measured in years. So if we put this all together, simple interest is equal to the principal, which is the amount of money we borrow, times the rate, which is an interest percentage, times the time in years, the amount of time we're borrowing the money. So let's look at an example of calculating simple interest. Pretend you are going to borrow $80,000 to purchase land. The bank tells you that you are going to purchase that at a 4% interest rate. They're going to charge you 4% because you're taking a loan. And you plan to pay back the loan in 20 years. It's going to take you 20 years to pay this back. How much interest would you have to pay the bank? We know that we are going to use our simple interest formula because we are looking for how much interest. This is the key words that tell me I need this formula. So I know that our formula is I equals P times R times T. Now, the interest is the value that we don't know. It says how much interest, so we don't know that. So I'm just going to leave the I written there. I know that P stands for the principal, the amount of money that I plan to borrow. How much money do I plan to borrow? $80,000. I'm going to borrow $80,000. So instead of writing the P, I'm going to write 80,000. Now I'm going to multiply that by the R, which in this case stands for rate of interest. Now notice, the rate of interest is a percent, but we need it as a decimal. Here is our rate. It is 4%. Percent literally means out of 100, so I need the 4 in the hundredths column. What will I put in the tenths column to hold the value? A 0. So 4% is the same as 0.04. So instead of writing the R, I'm going to write 0.04. Lastly, T stands for time in years. And I am borrowing the money for 20 years. So instead of writing the T, I'm going to write 20. Now, we could multiply this out on paper, but for time, I'm going to use my calculator. So I'm going to pull up the calculator, and I'm going to figure out 80,000 times 0.04 times 20. So I will type 80,000 times 0.04 times 20. Now you can see that I got 64,000. Now what this means is, in addition to paying the bank back the $80,000 that I borrowed, I also have to pay them back $64,000 in interest. So the interest that I have to pay the bank is $64,000. This is the amount of money the bank earns. If I want to know how much I would have to pay back in all, I would have to add the amount that I borrowed, which would be $80,000, plus the interest, which would be $64,000, to get $144,000 in all. So even though the loan was only for $80,000, I'm actually going to end up paying back $144,000 in all. Let's try another example. So let's pretend you are begging your parents to buy you a dirt bike. Instead of them buying it for you, they agree to give you a $4,000 loan, which would be called our principal. So I'm going to put a letter P here. For 2 years. What would 2 years stand for? Our time. So I'm going to put a T here. If you pay them back a 2.5% rate of interest. So that is our R, our rate of interest. Now we are looking for how much extra we would have to pay them. Well, I do not hear how much interest. However, the word extra is implying the interest. The extra money that we have to pay them because we took the loan. Now we know that interest is equal to principal times the rate times the time. Our principal is the amount of money that we are borrowing. How much money are we borrowing? We are borrowing $4,000 times the rate. How much is our rate? Our rate is 2.5%. Now you may have difficulty taking this to a decimal. But think about, what if it was just 2%? What would that look like? Well, that's 2 out of 100, or 0.02. So if it's 2.5%, that's 2.5 out of 100, or 0.025. Treat it as a whole number and put the decimal after. So instead of writing R, we're going to write 0.025 times our T, which stands for time. Our time that we're borrowing in this case is for 2 years. So I'll put a 2 there. Now, again, you could multiply this out on paper. We are going to use our calculator for sake of time. So we are going to type 4,000 times 0.025, which is our rate, times 2, which is our years. And when we do that, we get 200. So what does that mean? That means that the amount of interest we have to pay our parents is $200 extra. Now, if you want to know how much you would have to pay them back in all, you would add that interest to the amount that you borrowed. So if you borrowed $4,000, you would add 200 to it, and you would pay them $4,200 in all. 200 of which was interest. Let's do one last example. Pretend you want to buy a pink punch bug for your 16th birthday. I know you girls will like that. The bank gives you a loan for $9,000. So here's your loan amount, also known as your principal, for 3 years, which is the value of time, at a 6% annual rate of interest. Annual just means every year, so you don't need to worry about that part. It says how much interest, which shows that we are looking for that extra amount of money. How much interest would you have to pay them back? So we need our formula because we're looking for how much interest. Interest equals principal times rate times time. Now, our principal is the amount of money that we borrow. So we borrowed $9,000 times our rate, which they tell us is 6%. How do you write 6% as a decimal? 6% means 6 out of 100, which is 0.06. So our rate is 0.06 times our time, which we are borrowing for 3 years. Pull up our calculator to do that calculation. Take 9,000 times, the 9,000 was our principal, times 0.06, which is our rate of interest, times 3, because that's how many years we're going to borrow it, and that gives us 1,620. So if you are going to buy this pink punch bug with this type of loan, your interest, the amount of extra money that you have to pay the bank, equals $1,620. So you would have to pay back the $9,000 that you used to buy the car, plus an additional $1,620, giving you a total of $10,620 in all. That is how much you would have to pay back the bank in all. So let's summarize. Few people have enough money saved to pay for their house in full. Instead, many people rely on a bank to give them a loan. Banks charge people interest. This is how banks earn their money. And that interest, if it's simple interest, is calculated by principal times rate times time, where principal is the amount of money that you borrow, the rate is the interest rate that they're charging you, and T, which is time, is the number of years that you plan to borrow the money.